Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the top 20 pro players and analyze their gameplay in tournaments to determine what their biggest weakness is. This list is of course subjective. It is my opinion on the players, and I get my opinion from both playing against them in tournaments and also watching them play in some tournaments as well, where I'd be casting or just watching on the side. And it's really kind of a nice list because everyone has weaknesses, everyone has places to improve, and by laying it all out, we can kind of generate some discussion as to where players can improve and what we can expect from certain players going forward. I left myself out of the list, but I wanted to leave it upon you guys in the comments to let me know what you think my biggest weakness is in tournaments, what you think I should be working on, because I'm always trying to improve as a player, and public feedback, no matter who it comes from, is usually a very good thing, and it's definitely something that helps me improve my game and continue learning. This list is in no particular order, but we got 20 pro players here, and I'm going to go ahead and dive right into it. And of course, before we get truly started, just a quick reminder to come on down to my Twitch channel and watch me live. We love to see new faces coming in from YouTube, and we have a really good time there playing and casting games on live stream. So love to see you guys check that out and support me there. All right, let's go into the list. To start things off, we've got the French player margougou, widely considered to be the second best French player, only second to Sitaux, and he's actually a very solid player who's got some decent results in recent tournaments, slowly starting to break into that top 16 and getting some top results in the S tier qualifiers and even making it to some of the biggest tournaments in Age of Empires 2 right now. I think margougou has a really solid micro and macro sense. He's actually very aggressive when he wants to be and also has relatively good defense, but I've noticed he's got one major weakness, and is that he doesn't play the map. He doesn't kind of respect what map control can bring to the table and often lets his opponents take a crucial hill in front of his base, or when he has the chance to take a forward hill, he kind of just doesn't capitalize on it and just prefers to play with his expo and knights and just harass and kill villes instead of launching a big push and controlling a hill in a crucial spot. Of course, it is something he can work on more, and it's something that can really develop him as a player going into those later tournament stages. Next up on the list, we got Sebastian. He is widely considered to be the best Uruguayan player, and in my opinion, he's one of the up-and-coming players that has the most potential. He's also relatively young, same with margougou. I think he's around 21 years old right now, or maybe 22, and so the future is looking bright. He's got a bunch of years ahead of him right now. And as far as Sebastian, I feel like he's one of the best micro players when it comes to archer micro. He is so good and so aggressive with that first ball of crossbows, and even the very best in the world can't really go head-to-head when it comes to microing against him. However, I feel like his biggest success is also his biggest weakness. While he's very good with archers, I feel like he's a little bit too predictable by always going towards them, and I think he just has to diversify and get equally good with his knight play, his infantry play, and his booming skills, because if all of those can match the level of archers, we're looking at basically a top 5 player. However, at the moment, he's really good with archers and just not as comfortable with the other things in the game. This also makes it so it's pretty predictable when going up against him. We can always just play towards a defensive skirms plus wall game and not die to initial archers and simply outpace him in the later stages of the game. Definitely a really solid player and one to look out for. Next up on the list, we got freakinandy here, and he's definitely a solid player overall when it comes to a lot of the monk siege pushes, a lot of the late game skills that you might expect from a top player. Andy's actually really good at that because he comes from a deathmatch background, and deathmatch, for those who don't know, is a post-imperial game mode where you start with a ton of resources and it's basically all about the late game. And so he transferred that over to random map, which is the general standard game mode, and he's actually really solid in the late game. His big weakness though comes from the early game. I think his feudal age is definitely subpar compared to some of the other players around, and if he wants to really make it as a consistent player in these big events, he definitely has to work on his early game, and he has to get comfortable playing in the feudal age, because if you try to kind of jump towards that late game too fast, or try to fast cast and jump towards that booming style too early where you can rely on your monk and siege, you will get exposed by a lot of players that like to play aggressive in the early game, guys like Vivi that can really take advantage of that, and you will have a lot of trouble in those tournament rounds. So definitely getting better and more comfortable in the feudal age is the next step for freakinandy, and then we can expect really big things from him. Moving on to Vinchester now. I feel like Vinchester is one of those players that's been around for quite a long time, and it's been performing in and out of these tournaments, even winning an S tier tournament as well. So he definitely has the potential, and definitely a very solid and well-respected player. I personally find Vinchester a very tricky opponent to go up against always, because I feel like he's very aggressive when the time is right, and he also has a very well-balanced game. The thing is, his biggest weakness comes in his expansion and the late game. I feel like he always tries to put pressure in that early imp territory where he wants to get that forward castle and kind of end end the game fast, but by doing that repeatedly, he's a bit neglected his late game and his expansion of the economy. So expansion militarily on the sides with castles on the hills, with military buildings further on the sides, and also expanding in terms of your economy, which is like, spreading out with town centers, more farms, keeping the economy spread out and harder to raid. And I feel like that's just one thing that Vinchester just never really does in his games, and maybe that's probably why when he's forced to do it, he's just not as experienced and not as good with it. So definitely expanding both militarily and economically in that late game is something he needs to work on. Next up, we've got Capoch, and honestly, there's not really a big weakness for Capoch that he has to work on, but I feel like sometimes he tries to play either too aggressive or too defensive, and sometimes he tries to fully wall his base and then rush to attack as well. And there's just some holes in the game at certain times that he gets punished by trying to do too many things at the same time, like trying to attack constantly while also trying to have no pressure at home. If the game sometimes gets out of hand or out of control, I feel like Capoch might take a little bit more damage than needed. However, he is pretty decent in those messy games, so maybe he invites the messy games to come to him, but sometimes I feel like he can just kind of play a cleaner game by staying at home a little bit, not trying to rush too far forward to get that first punch and be the first player to be aggressive. It is obviously nice to be aggressive more often than not, but sometimes the matchup calls for a defensive start, and Capoch has to recognize that a bit more often. Next up, we got Sitaux, which is considered to be the best French player. And I think Sitaux definitely really solid player overall, very aggressive, very hard to play against. And he loves to play with those forward castles and the messy games. He really welcomes them. But I do think he needs to get comfortable with the booming style and the hyper late game to stay unpredictable. I don't remember the last time I've seen Sitaux play a proper late game in tournaments. It feels like he always tries to play with those forward castles where both players are very weak. There's not a lot of villagers on the table, but I haven't really seen him play those late games where he's at 140 villas, opponents at 140 villas, and he's out macroing and winning the late game. Definitely have to get better in the late game because that makes you less predictable and more flexible as a player. And so that way, even if the forward castles are not really working, you have something to fall back on, and that will make Sitaux a much more well-rounded player. Next up, we got Nicov, which is the best Argentinian player. Capoch was second best earlier, I would say, according to most people. And I feel like with Nicov, he has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. I think there's a little bit of propaganda around Nicov as a player. People think that he forgets eco upgrades and he always skips them. That might have been true like 5-6 years ago, but Nicov has evolved as a player. And at that point, anyone who's just uttering that, completely disregarded. It's completely false. It's just some propaganda being spread. It's not true at all. He's actually very good at getting his eco upgrades. Sure, he might miss one or two here or there, but everyone does. But that's not his problem. His problem and his biggest weakness is definitely the late game wood line and economy efficiency. He will always have a lot of villagers, but they're not going to be the most efficient villagers who have like 80 villagers on wood, a lot of them bumping, multiple lumber camps in the same area blocking villagers, and just an overall messy economy state for Nicov in the late game. So definitely just has to clean things up, make his economy much more efficient in the late game, use those vills in a good manner and don't keep a lot of them idle or bumping, and he'll have a much better job as a player in those late games because I think everything else in this game is very, very top tier. Next up, we got Barles, and he is the best player from Poland. And one player that's been actually doing very well recently and kind of proven himself to be a top 16 player comfortably. Comfortably a top 16 player, and now trying to fight for the spot in the top 8 consistently. He did make it in the last tournament, Warlords 2. And I think the one thing that Barles is missing is actually just sharpening up the build orders. When I look at Barles as a player, I think he's really good at like the Monk Siege play, the fast stimp play, the different strategies, probably because he plays so much Rage Forest that tests his different skill sets and his strategies. I feel like he's very well-rounded there, very creative. He also plays very comfortable games in Feudal Age, regular, Scouts into Knights games, regular map control games. He's very comfortable booming as well. He's extremely well-rounded as a player and a strategist, but I think his biggest mistake comes from not being or biggest weakness, I should say, comes from not being as sharp in those early game build orders. Sometimes he'll just be like 30 seconds late to Castle Age compared to another player, and usually that could be enough to lose you the game. And so I feel like when playing against Barles, I'm not so worried about him punishing my mistakes very hard. I'm much more worried about him getting a chance to play his own game. And so if he just got better at, making the builds a bit sharper, punishing the smaller mistakes, and really being tight with those early game strategies, I feel like he'd be a much more dangerous player and a big threat to that top 8. Next up, we got hearttt, and hearttt is the best player from Peru and also a teammate of mine. I feel like heartt's a very solid player when he's able to play his game. He made it top 16 in the last tournament, Warlords 2, and so he's definitely cracking into those top scenes and probably has a lot more potential as well once things start to click for him. I feel like heartt's biggest mistake or biggest weakness is the fact that he just tries to fight way too often with his military. This is a big problem that I feel like a lot of players have, especially when they're climbing the ladder, and it's because the optimal way to play is to fight as much as you can, right? Fighting is important. You force your opponent to take trades, you play aggressive, and you gain advantage. But sometimes if you overdo it, I feel like sometimes you leave yourself exposed at home for counterattacks, since you're always trying to play aggressive and force your opponent to trade against you. So you get exposed to counterattacks. Sometimes you just should be waiting and just waiting to get to Castle Age or to another power spike instead of trying to attack right now. And so it just leads to like messier games, leads to a lot of extra risks being taken where he just doesn't need to. And yeah, sometimes the best thing to do is just to play safe and wait to see what your opponent does, let him make the first move and punish and counterattack. By hearttt always trying to be the guy attacking, always be the guy fighting, he kind of makes himself exposed to a lot of different things, and that's definitely something he needs to work on. Next up, we got Dogao, the best Brazilian player. And I feel like Dogao, I'm going to keep it short for him because I think he's a very well-balanced, very consistent player, plays all kinds of maps, solid across the board, but I do feel like he's way too passive. He's so comfortable giving up full map control. He'll fight with some army. He always has some army, but he's never going to overcommit to getting that map. And so I feel like sometimes against Dogao, if I just play my game, I can just always get to the late game. I can always get to a high villager count. I'm never really scared of him all-inning me or 1TC pushing me or really squeezing me out of the map control. He's always just playing a little bit too passive, and while I think that's a good play style, sometimes you got to mix it up and you got to go for the kill early. Next up, we got Vivi, the second best Chinese player. And Vivi, it's really simple. What he needs to work on is simply his drafting skills. Vivi is a different player. Similar to Mr. Yo, they like to pick a little bit different style of civs. They prefer the cavalry civs, the unique unit civs, and that shows in the draft because he picks those civs early. But the reality of it is, in the tournament draft, your opponent will be taking what's considered to be like the best civilizations more often than not. They're not going to be picking the unique unit civs just because you like them. So Vivi should be prioritizing the stronger civs first, and then the last 2 or 3 picks, he can then pick the niche picks, the Spanish, the Magyars, the aggressive cavalry civs that players don't even want in their drafts in the first place. And so Vivi can prioritize the stronger civs, and then just last pick his comfort picks, his comfort civilizations, because chances are his opponent won't pick them. If Vivi decides to pick Spanish or Magyars, the comfort picks first, your opponent just ends up with freaking Mayans, Chinese, Slavs now that they're broken, Persians now that they're broken. You get what I'm saying. So it's just an example, but if you pick the comfort picks first, your opponent gets all the broken civs and you get screwed on the draft. Next up, we've got Jordan, and he is the #1 German player. Actually, Viper's in Germany right now, but you know what? Maybe we'll keep Jordan as the #1 German player anyways. But Jordan, I think he's a very, very well-rounded player, and actually one of the scariest matchups for me because he has incredible defense and he has incredible late game as well. He's very well-rounded, but I do think Jordan plays way too safe. He needs to take more risks, and it's not about taking the map control. I feel like he does a good job maintaining map control, but like I don't remember the last time I've seen Jordan go for a 1TC push. So I think taking more risks and kind of breaking out of your comfort zone might make Jordan a more dangerous player to go up against, because sometimes when a player is too safe, then the aggressive player that goes up against him has an easy time against him. And so someone like liereyy playing against Jordan, I feel like liereyy would just kind of have his way and do whatever strategy he wants to do because he knows that Jordan's going to stay on defense and try to play a little safe. And so there, liereyy can get into the comfort zone and start cracking his defense and just playing super aggressive. And it's hard for Jordan to keep up with that sometimes. Next up, we got villese, the #1 Finnish player, and I feel like villese has really made a name for himself over the past few years. Hit some semifinals, hit some finals in tournaments, runs deep in most tournaments, very consistent player, and his biggest mistake, or biggest weakness, I feel, is always defaulting to the 3TC play. 3TC play is probably the best way to go about it. It's like what is considered standard more often than not, but villese, maybe similar to Jordan, needs to mix it up and needs to go for more 1TC pushes to keep his opponents guessing. Not only 1TC pushes, but you can just go like tower rush and feudal age. Don't be afraid to get messy. Get dirty in some games because that makes it so your opponent doesn't know what to expect, and that makes your 3TC play even stronger because they don't know when it's going to come and when something else will come. So villese mixing it up and going for a little bit more aggressive plays might be what he needs. I also feel like sometimes he kind of lets opponents off the hook when they're making a few mistakes early. He won't punish them as much. He'll just continue developing himself, but sometimes you can be a little bit more cutthroat and look for those punishes. Next up, we got ACCM, and I feel like he is the #1 Vietnamese player, no question about it right now. And ACCM is extremely strong. I think he's very close to being a top 5 player, definitely a top 8 to 10 player at the moment, according to most people. And I think that ACCM has one clear weakness, and that's his defense. When ACCM is playing aggressive and really put in the pressure, he's easily a top 5, maybe even a top 3 player at doing that. But I think his defense needs a lot of work. ACCM is clearly not as comfortable playing on defense. He is a player that loves to play with the towers forward, loves to play with the map control. But as always, every player should be striving towards being a well-rounded player. And a well-rounded player is good on offense and is also good on defense. And I think ACCM needs to work on his defense and needs to be comfortable playing on the back foot and knowing how to not take as much damage when on that back foot so that he can eventually get back on the aggressive and win the games that way. Next up, we got MBL, and there's only 5 other people left after this, so we're getting to the end of the video here. I appreciate you guys staying through this video with me. I hope you guys are finding it enjoyable. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe as well while we're here, just so we don't forget and we boost that algorithm. But yeah, talking about MBL, I honestly feel like MBL is one of the best players overall that we have when it comes to actually playing the game. But I think he suffers from a lot of confidence issues. He's always going into tournaments with second guessing himself, with a lack of certainty in his strategy, lack of confidence in what he wants to do, and that is a very big red flag because a tournament you only get one chance, and yes, the stakes are high, but sometimes playing your game and playing comfortable will yield the best results. I remember in KOTD 5 he beat Viper game 1, very fast game, and MBL played a standard Arabia game, and then later on in the series, after he dropped a couple games, he started doing weird things like tower rushing Bengalis when playing with the mines, even though the mines are a much better civ than the Bengalis. And it's something I reminded him of plenty of times, but I would like to see him being a lot more confident in tournaments and approach them like he would a ladder game, playing his style, playing comfortable. And MBL style is usually very hard to deal with because he's a solid player, he's a good micro, good macro, and he has a lot of outside the box strategies. He likes to do a lot of weird things, and it keeps his opponents guessing. That is a dangerous player in a tournament, someone that keeps you guessing. And if MBL can play comfortably in tournaments and play his style, he's going to be someone to watch out for going into those later rounds. Next up on the list, we're getting into the top of the top when it comes to pro players. We've got liereyy, and I feel like liereyy is a very solid player when he's playing his game, but he is sadly a little bit predictable when it comes to playing aggressive. He does not like the tower rush. That's not where his aggression comes from. His aggression comes from super sharp builds, clean execution, and like hyper precision with his micro. He is so good. He might be the best expo player we have, for example, but he's not afraid to play Knight, Siege, and Monk as well. He's gotten a lot better with that recently, so he can play aggressive with a bunch of different compositions. But I do think that liereyy lacks one crucial thing, which is sometimes the best play is to not go for the offensive play and instead just opt to play defensive with more economy and wait for your opponent to make the first move. This is, I think, something similar to what hearttt struggles with, who's trying to fight too much, as I mentioned earlier. liereyy, who's also a teammate of mine, sometimes needs to just give up the pressure, let his opponent make the first move, and just opt for a defensive approach, because sometimes the matchup calls for that and sometimes the map calls for that. But liereyy will always try to play aggressive, and I think that's where his biggest weakness is. If he mixes it up, he'd be an even more dangerous player. Also, I forgot to mention, but MBL and nicov are both my teammates as well, but I forgot to mention, I just don't want to make sure there's no drama or anything like that when watching the video. All right, moving on to tatoh now. Tatoh's a player that's honestly been kind of popping off recently. His tournaments have just been insane. 2022 and 2023 have been great years for tatoh, but I think he's secured himself a top 5 spot in a lot of people's eyes over the last few years in general. And I feel like tatoh, his biggest weakness is also his biggest success, which is to try to do outside the box things and like just off meta things, right? But why is that his biggest weakness? Sometimes I feel like he just tries to do too much. tatoh's a player where if he just plays normal games and just plays like the standard and like what we call the meta, which is usually like the best option available, is what everyone's trying to do. If tatoh just played that, he'd beat like 90% of players in tournaments, right? Like he's super solid. So sometimes I feel like play confident in what you want to do, draft to play like the meta stuff, and just keep 1 or 2 tricks every set. 1 or 2 tricks, 1 or 2 off meta strategies every set to give you an advantage with maybe a weaker pick. That would be much more impactful for tatoh than trying to do too many weird things in a series. So sometimes I feel like he just kind of outdoes himself by trying to confuse his opponent and ends up kind of just like ruining the draft for himself, or kind of ruining a few games that would have been easier to win in other ways. Next up on the list, we've got Daut, and Daut suffers from one major weakness. His strategy's on point. His strategy's fantastic. His micro is not half bad. Daut having bad micro is kind of an incorrect take. We meme about it, whatever, but it's not actually his weakness in my opinion. His forward castles, the Daut castles, again, not a weakness. Those are actually most of the time pretty good. And usually when he goes for a Daut castle, the game's lost anyways. But where is his biggest weakness is definitely taking bad fights instead of giving up some ground. Sometimes he just feels like, okay, I have to take the fight. He goes in and it's a disaster. And sometimes when I watch that happen, I'm like, you didn't have to take that at all. Like you did not need to take that fight. You were still in a great position if you just didn't fight. But since he took the bad fight, he gets snowballed out of control. And I've seen that happen multiple times against, monks, against different army compositions. And I feel like if Daut just reads fights a little bit better and opts not to take them and give up a little bit of ground instead, he'd be a lot more dangerous of a player because he's not going to kind of make those mistakes in the early rounds of tournament, and he'd be much more consistent because it's going to be very hard to take out a guy with the strategy level of Daut if he's not making those mistakes. All right, I got two left, and I think you guys know who they are. Up next, we've got Mr. Yo, the #1 Chinese player, easily top 4, top 5 in a lot of people's books. And I think his only weakness that I can think of is simply his refusal to play archer civs. And I feel like this not only makes his draft weaker, because it makes it so like a lot of the top archer civs, you don't even have to consider them when going up against them because he like never picks them. Like Ethiopian's never going to be drafted. Britain's never going to be drafted. Other strong archer civs, he likes to play them more like a cav. Mayans, Aztecs, he always plays them towards eagles. He just doesn't play archers, except if he like absolutely has to. And I feel like this does make his drafting weaker, but it also makes him a bit more predictable as a player. I think part of the reason why he does this though is because he usually plays in high ping games because he is from China and most players are from Europe. And so naturally there's going to be at least 150 to 200 ping. So it's understandable why he goes for more cav civs. But like imagine in a LAN event where there's no ping or like 0 ping and he's still picking cav civs. And I feel like a lot of the archer civs he gives to his opponent and then he kind of loses to them with some of the cav civs that he chose. So I feel like trying to mix in some archer civs into the playstyle might be helpful for him. Or you know what? This has been working out for him pretty well so far. So maybe stick to your guns and we'll just give up the archer civs to the opponent and maybe he's fine doing that. Who knows? But that's kind of the one weakness I see from Yo. All right, last but not least here, we've got the Viper, and the Viper has a couple weaknesses that I was debating between. Of course, I say that he's very good in all the aspects of the game, but the one weakness that I saw from Viper is actually one of his strengths as well, and it's quick walling. I consider Viper to be one of the best, if not the best, quick wallers in the game. He's so good at it, he's so confident with it, he's never shaky, he's always doing it very well. But I swear he's just sometimes obsessed with doing it, and he's doing it way too much. Sometimes there'd be fires everywhere in his base, and he's busy quick walling the one villager, and he maybe gets it, maybe he saves the one vill, but there's so many other things falling apart that I feel like it's just not worth it. And this happens consistently in a lot of his games and tournaments. And so while I think quick walling is great to have, especially how good he is at doing it, it's a really good tool to have in your arsenal. But also on the other hand, maybe it's best to just like not quick wall as much when other things are just more important to do. In fairness and in defense to Viper though, on this, I feel like players have gotten a lot better at anti-quick walling. Like 2-3 years ago, no one knew how to stop the opponent from quick walling, but now people realize that if you just hit and move forward, your opponent won't really be able to quick wall as easily. And so the quick walling strat as a whole is a lot worse right now because of how good the players got at counterplaying it. And so maybe he's just stuck onto some bad habits, or maybe he just likes to do it and he thinks the pros outweigh the cons. But from my perspective, I feel like sometimes it costs him more than it benefits him. All right, that's going to do it for this video. Again, make sure to leave in the comments what you think my biggest weakness is. I'd love to hear what you guys think. And again, keep it in terms of tournament play, because in ladder games, I make so many mistakes and my biggest weakness is existing. Thanks so much for watching the video. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know if you do enjoy videos like these. I'll make more of them, of course, and much love, guys. YouTube has been doing super well recently. Very happy about this. Take care and peace for now.